I think we'll start the proceedings now, and let me just first begin with a statement on the acknowledgement of traditional land. We would like to acknowledge this sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. It has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. So, I would like to welcome you all to this seminal event for the Center for Critical Development Studies and the various IDS programs. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Jeremy Adelman back to his undergraduate alma mater and to hear his talk about development or justice. But before we introduce Jeremy, I'd like to just welcome all of you of different constituencies here one by one. And the first I'd like to welcome here are the first-year students in our IDS AO1 class. It's really good that you could have come, although I realize that you had to come. Anyway, we hope that this is an amazing opportunity for all of you to listen to a first-class lecturer and a first-class intellect on issues of development and development history. I'm sure you will enjoy it immensely. I'd also like to welcome just all the various students in the IDS programs. It's great to have you here. I'd like to welcome the various faculty within the IDS program, and perhaps a few of you from other departments. It's also great. We have a very nice, large, robust audience tonight. In addition, another integral part of our CCDS and IDS community are our alumni, of which I know there are a number here, partners in the field, our NGO partners in the field. It's great to also have you here. And finally, a welcome to all those within the broader university who have made the trek out to Scarborough today. Thank you for coming. But finally, briefly, and more will be said here, I'd like to welcome Al Berry, for whom this lecture is named. Al is sitting in front. I won't embarrass him and make him stand up. So Al is beloved of all of his students, including Jeremy and I, who had the pleasure of having a course with him in our final years as undergraduate at the University of Toronto. He's a terrific intellectual mentor and teacher for students, universally respected. And he has been a very important development economist, and perhaps that might link up with our talk today, perhaps along the lines of Albert Hirschman, whose biography was magisterially written by our speaker, Jeremy Adelman. So it's great, Al, to have you here in person, and again, welcome to all. The final welcome I would like to make is to our principal. There he is. It is wonderful to have our new principal, Wisdom Teti, here with us tonight. You can imagine how busy he might be in his very first term, and indeed really in his very first month here at UTSC. But I think we've managed to cajole his presence, both with our speaker, but I think that development studies and political science study of the developing world is close to Wisdom's own interest and heart. So anyway, Wisdom, thank you very much for coming. It's great to have you here and part of our community. So the order of procedure from now will be, first of all, we'll have Aaron and Marie come up and talk to you a little bit about this fabulous international development conference that our students run every year, and it's a fantastic event, and I think there will be encouragement for all of you to become involved in some form or other as volunteers. I will then request one of our faculty members in the Center for Critical Development Studies, Professor Anya Manuel Byrne, to introduce our speaker, Jeremy Adelman. Then we will have our talk, the key event of the evening. But there will also be time after Jeremy's talk for you to ask questions. And these questions, I would highly encourage our first-year students to be jotting down little questions as you're listening to his talk. There are mics set up on either side, both aisles. Once the talk is over, please feel free to line up at either aisle. We'll show you how to turn on the mics, and then we will have a question and answer period for a period of time. And then we will close with a thank you. Anyway, great to have you all here. Welcome. And Aaron and Marie, could you come up briefly?
Hi everyone, my name is Aaron, this is Marie, and we're the co-chairs of this year's International Development Conference. So the International Development Conference, it takes place at UTSC, and it brings together practitioners, academics, and students to come together and talk about current issues happening in development. Last year, the theme was revolved around movements, so the movements of populations, the movements of social justice and activism, and movements within the development field.
Sorry. So for those of you all who'd like to keep in touch with our event, he's a lot taller than I am. We are releasing programming information, so this includes an official theme launch, committee updates, and other related information and material to get you ready for this year's conference, which is happening on February 9th, 2018. Mark your calendars for that. You can keep up to date on our website, social media, and through email subscription, all of which can be found at our table outside this room after the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. And I highly encourage you all to get involved. It really is a fabulous, fabulous event every year. All of the faculty go. So, Anna Manuel, if you could come up and introduce our speaker.
It's a delight to introduce this evening's Al Berry lecturer, Professor Jeremy Adelman, to us all. To begin with the formal, our guest is Henry Charles Lee, Professor of History at Princeton University, where he runs a global history lab. Now, I'm a historian of public health, so my wonder is whether the lab rats carry fleas with the bacillus for the Black Death. Who knows? He also chairs the Princeton University Press editorial board, so any of you with a book in the making, you now have a shoe-in to publishing with Princeton. Just kidding, just kidding. Professor Adelman did his graduate work at the London School of Economics and at Oxford, and has also hung out at various universities in Paris and Buenos Aires, among other locales, and been awarded a Guggenheim and a range of similarly prestigious fellowships. His research spans multiple centuries and foci: Argentinian labor, economic and development history, humanitarian photography, high finance and low politics in the 19th century, socio-political legacies of colonialism, the Latin American debt crisis, which he dubs tequila hangover, not recommended, political ideology and social development, the politics of money, and the effects of agricultural mechanization and rural debt in Argentina and Canada, and so much more. He is, for those of you familiar with Isaiah Berlin's clever anthropomorphized academic types, both a proverbial hedgehog and a fox, as comfortable in the minutiae of farming practices in the Argentinian Pampa as he is in grand debates around imperialism, revolution, and world history. Professor Adelman also shares some characteristics with folks in the younger generation, such as The Weeknd, Nelly Furtado, Lily Singh, Ryan Gosling, Samantha Bee, Rachel McAdams, and others. He's a Torontonian who has made good in that larger madness south of the border. Professor Adelman's biography of Albert Hirschman, a highly influential but until his prize-winning doorstopper, widely forgotten and little understood quintessential 20th century development economist, is a tour de force. Adelman's account of Hirschman's daring and fascinating life experience and his perspicacious and anti-establishment ideas around the unintended consequences and unexpected successes of development is fantastic. If my search engine has counted correctly, the book has received 370 reviews, even eliciting a ringing endorsement from Fernando Henrique Cardoso, former president of Brazil and a development studies expert himself. Now, tonight's lecture honors Professor Al Berry for his instrumental and inspirational role as a founder and lifelong advocate of what we now call critical development studies at UTSC. We are beyond fortunate to have Professor Berry with us this evening. Indeed, in many ways, he's a linchpin connecting Jeremy Adelman and all of us to Albert Hirschman, for example. Not only did Professor Berry know Hirschman and spar with him on occasion, perhaps Hirschman was envious that Al Berry is the only gringo North American economist I know of to be unreservedly and widely revered across Latin America. But also, Professor Berry had a young Jeremy Adelman in his classroom as an undergraduate at the U of T, as you've heard. Yes, Jeremy Adelman was once one of you. Now, my intel has it that Jeremy was a very keen student, taking a graduate course with Al Berry, and he may even have been motivated by his professor's trajectory. After all, Al is an Ontario farm boy turned Latin Americanist. So let's picture Jeremy Adelman a few decades back, confidently presenting his latest research paper to his fellow classmates. Then fast forward to tonight, another occasion when we will undoubtedly be regaled with insightful comparative and global analysis around the deep dilemmas, past and present, of development or justice. And here's hoping that, like Drake, Professor Adelman will return often to champion Toronto.
Thank you. So much. Okay, I'm going to start, make sure I don't screw this up here. It's green, so. Wow. I mean, there's nowhere to go but really down from something like that, so I don't know whether to thank you or curse you, but Anna Emanuel, really, such generous words. And I don't know who talked to you about that seminar. Was it Al or Paul or... I mean, okay, so I promise not to be as loquacious this evening as I was in that seminar. I remember being very verbose. So I want to thank, this very personally very moving experience. This is the first time I've come back to U of T to lecture. I spent some really, really wonderful years here. I grew up on U of T campus. My father was a graduate student here, and so this is coming home. But it was also coming home because, as Anna Emanuel mentioned, it was through the exposure to the faculty at the University of Toronto, what was then the Department of Political Economy, that I began to think of myself as someone who would study development. Professor Berry, I'm having a hard time calling you Al Berry. So pardon me if I slip into the formalisms, but was of course instrumental. He taught the seminar that Paul and I took. We were both undergraduates. It was a graduate seminar, one of these hybrid things, which was very intimidating. But, and here I may be causing problems for you guys, for the faculty in the room, Al Berry's door was always open. I don't know, I don't know if you remember this, giving me books to read. I had just come back from Columbia having spent a year in South America, a little bit lost, and gave me stuff to read. I could go on and burn up the rest of the time here, which I don't want to do. But you did give me a primer at that stage, and little that I know, 30 years later, on a debate that happened in Columbia in the 1950s, which I won't go into detail, between Lachlan Curry and Albert Hirschman. 30 years later, out comes the Hirschman biography. I could go on. What I'm going to do this evening, though, thanks to you, is actually, in a way, pull back and give you 150 years of a history of debate about what is development. And it's part of a larger project that a book that I'm trying to finish now, which is about global thinking and the history of our arguments over the virtues and the vices of depending on strangers and having strangers depend on us at home. It recounts the story of how humans came to deal with, to embrace, and to reject, I think we have to deal with the rejection of this as well, their dependence upon strangers once local worlds opened up into one interconnected and interdependent world. This has been the source of hopes. I think hopefully that's what's motivating a lot of you here, and of horrors, of one world dreaming and unspeakable atrocities. In our day of climate change and nation firsters, how we handle our fragile togetherness will shape the lives of generations to come. But this evening I want to focus on one theme, one strand of the book, a set of arguments, because one of the big challenges of our day is understanding how global convergence, what is called convergence or interdependence, produces at the same time inequality, so that integration produces togetherness, but also it yields stratification. And this has been on the minds of political economists, social scientists since the 1850s. I'll make sure this thing works. Yes, okay. So it's a long-running debate, and I carry you this debate, and now I realize that you have some of you have assignments to write about things in this lecture. I might throw out some kind of questions, and I'll tell stories about particular characters that you can follow up on as you write your papers or assignments. This story of the debate rests on a tripod, has 3 legs for a century and a half, and they are, just to recount them on the screen here, how to understand the relationship between integration and inequality. How to bring them back together into the same frame has been at the heart of the debates about what development is. Some positions have pinpointed the importance of internal factors in accounting for, you get stratification with integration. Others focus on external forces. We're going to get into that internal debate over the soul of development. The second argument here of this tripod is that we must see these debates as global debates, unfolding in many corners of an integrating planet at the same time. This was not just because we need to hear the forgotten and ignored voices for their own sake, although that has its own function, but as we will see, the views of Chinese and Peruvian observers were important for spotlighting unequal convergence. That is, it was from strangers that lessons can be learned about global justice. And the third, if we can engage the voices that called attention to how the world was being brought together and being made more unfair at the same time, we can see a long debate about the global condition differently. In fact, this debate about global inequality mapped onto a long debate about the domestic inequality. And the deepest tradition for thinking about national inequality, domestic inequality, and growth or accumulation was informed by, if not outright part, of socialism. Just as socialism was the framework for addressing intrinsic inequalities at the domestic or the national level, development was the framework for undoing inequality at the global level. Development and socialism had similar, if not parallel, parabolic structures, rising over the course of the 19th century, gaining speed over the 20th century, and running into a crisis a century later. So these three claims have one point, which I'm going to get back to at the end of the lecture. And that is that thinking about development has to recuperate ideas of redistribution, which lay at the core of a century of debates. So what you're going to see this evening is a history in the service of thinking about global distributive justice. And as the title, or just to flip back, suggests, that there's a choice to be made. Or do we have development or justice? It's meant to provoke you. In fact, what I want to argue is I want to recuperate a long debate that has framed things differently in terms of and, or even as, development as justice. So development might be seen as a way of thinking about distribution. Nowadays, of course, inequality is all the rage. On the right, and here's a bottom, you can see a very famous incendiary poster during the Brexit campaign in Britain a few years ago, and the President of the United States, recognizable, I hope, up on the left-hand side there. But not just on the right, but on the left as well. What's important is that there is a growing consensus that global integration has been a driver of inequality, which is sparking the backlash against what's called globalism, with a curled lip. And it goes under the label of globalization. That word, as you're going to see later in the lecture, itself has a history. It meant something very different in 1980 when the North-South Report and Willy Brandt's committee, which I'll talk about at the end, coined the term globalization. The solution, of course, for not so much her, but certainly these characters, has been to reverse convergence, to exit. Right? It was actually called Brexit for a reason. My question, though, is that the only option? Is the only solution to inequality to exit the world economy? Well, the century of development thinking that I'm going to talk about suggests otherwise. That development offered, I want to argue, a language, a framework for policy making and social agency that acknowledged interdependence, but insisted that there had to be some redistribution to make it work, for moral and for material reasons. It's a story that began over a century ago, in the middle of the 19th century. I'm going to really start compressing this story. I'm not going to plod you through 150 years or more of history. But just to note that this puzzle about how integration produced inequality was something that was remarked upon from the 1850s onwards. And if you read journalists and political economists, Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill were both commenting on this, that as the world was being laced together by railroads and cables, free trade, and so forth, it was also producing more stratification. But it was in the 1890s that the world, awash with strikes from Chicago to Cape Town, what contemporaries at the time called the social question, and peasant insurgencies from northeast Brazil to the Mekong Delta, that we stumbled upon what we would recognize as the elements of development debate. Let me just, as an aside here, note that throughout this story, one of the important variables in fueling this debate will be the ways in which disparities are being made visible in the public sphere. An important actor in this, and if you want to Google this, I'm going to give you little things to think about if you're writing your reports, was a photographer who was a crime photographer in New York in the 1880s, who wrote a very famous book called How the Other Half Lives, as an expose of the dark side. And literally, he took these shots at night. He experimented with flash photography to illuminate the dark precincts of the city to the bourgeois readership of New York. But this was happening at a global scale as well. Photographs and stories moving in from the outer reaches of the world to tell a narrative of global convergence and of disparity. So even as American and Canadian farmers and the birth of populism in Canada began in this era, the stalwarts of all that was promising about the integration of frontiers into the world market were railing about being, in the case of the United States, crucified on a cross of the global gold standard. So the end of the 19th century, this photograph was taken in, I think, 1889. The end of the 19th century did more than anticipate the challenges of farmers of the world who left their self-sufficient ways to reap the bounty of the marketplace. It also summoned economists, anthropologists, journalists to serve another aspect of global integration, not just to tell truths about the losers of the process of integration. The wars in the Philippines, 1898, South Africa, I'll get to that shortly, Cuba, Korea, as well as a global tide of enclosures of what were then called barbarous peoples, including the people who were named in Paul's opening. It's indigenous people around the world were incorporated into the world market or excluded from their lands that were made valuable through colonization. Around the world, pit imperial powers against others whom they now had to govern. Part of convergence meant governing these new subject peoples. American Marines and German troops found themselves plodding through tropical forests in the Philippines and Namibia with ethnographers and photographers in tow to pursue villagers and guerrillas who had different, as in guerrilleros, by the way, who had different ideas of governance and property than the scientific conquistadors. We could draw examples from London, from Paris, from the Ivy League, from Toronto, but let's go to Tokyo. The new methods and ideas about settlement and integration of peoples into the world market, convergence, closely aligned with racialized doctrines of social differentiation and civilization. Nitobe Inazo, pictured here in 1919, he was one of the members of the Japanese delegation to the Paris peace talks after the First World War, which I'm going to come to shortly, because 1919 was like year zero for the birth of development studies. I'll actually take that as a hypothesis. I'll get to it in just a minute. He was a Japanese, born again. We talked a little bit about missionaries and the role that missionaries play in creating development. That's something, there's another one, something to write about. He was a born again agricultural economist, redeployed terms like colony and colonization to depict how Tokyo's new empire of the late 19th century should view its possessions, like Korea and eventually Taiwan, whose, quote, natives could be corralled to work for God's plan for Japan. Along the way, a technocratic elite going to university. You're doing critical development studies, so it's a little different, right? A technocratic elite had to be trained in a new field for the age, what was called, and development came out of what was called for Japan, colonial policy studies, rolled out for the country's new Western model institution of learning, the Imperial University of Tokyo, one of the world's great universities, which became the standard bearer for Japan. So for Nitobe then, for Japan to catch up with the West required empire, required colonization, required the integration of racialized other people for the sake of Japanese development. The only way for Japan to develop, to modernize, was by integrating. And the question then became, well, how to integrate? By 1900, not everybody was so euphoric about this model. Let's cross from Japan to China and consider Liang Qichao. Liang was aware of the Western shadow. He was also very aware of the spread of the Japanese presence in East Asia, particularly after the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95. You all should be studying history, by the way, when you study development, so this stuff should be second nature to you. He came from Guangdong province, where commercial, financial, and missionary penetration into China was most intense, and he steeped himself in Western texts. He then traveled to Beijing in 1895 to sit for his exams, and it was, of course, in that year that the shock of the loss to Japan, to Beijing, to China during that war sparked the immediate realization that the world had decisively changed. This is the point about enclosure and integration, that it had changed the comforts of Sinocentrism. Quote, the defeat of 1895, the loss of Taiwan, and 200 million taels in reparations awoke in our nation, he wrote, from its 4,000-year-long dream that we can no longer be isolated from the rest of the world. Likening China to the Ottoman Empire, he coined the term sick man of Asia, you may have heard it, as an epithet. In Shanghai, he would found a newspaper called Chinese Progress to celebrate the virtues of industrialization and education and to circulate the gospel of social Darwinism and to promote what he called the science of group strength, to overturn backwardness. That's a key word for us here. For Liang and others would eventually become more bitter about the potential uplifting of economic integration, began to be more skeptical about what this would mean for the relative have-nots. For integration for weak countries could spell their doom. In the wake of the Boxer Rebellion, which you're going to also look into, in 1902, when the Japanese would also establish a foothold in China as well as Westerners in the wake of a series of humiliating treaties, Liang would author a bitter diatribe, and it was called On the New Rules for Destroying Countries, cataloging the fates of Poland, India, and Egypt at the hands of capitalists. He used that term. Quote, to those who claim, he said, that opening mining, railroad, and concessionary rights to foreigners is not harmful to the sovereignty of the whole, I advise you to read the history of the Boer War. And in 1902, the very same year that John Hobson would write a very influential book called Imperialism, he would publish, Liang published, a fascinating book, a kind of counterfactual utopian novel set in the year 2062, called The Future of New China, which begins during the 50th anniversary of the late Qing reform in Shanghai and the celebration of World Expo. I'm going to get to dreaming of futures as a kind of motif for thinking about development as histories of some utopian project. So by 1900 then, integration was on everybody's lips, and there was growing awareness of global enclosure, which produced euphorias and anxieties. I'm offering these two voices of a Japanese and a Chinese observer to remind ourselves that the debate about global integration and inequality was not a European creation. It was, as we say in global history, polycentric. It had multiple points of origins. The development debates were global from the start, which is why we need to tell the story of development, the field that you're all in, as a global narrative. In a capsule, the 19th century gave us several ways of thinking about economic development at a global scale. The first was that integration spurred competition. And for some, this meant creating rules and norms to prevent the competition from spinning out of control. And for some, it meant grabbing whatever you could while you could. If you're looking for an example of how people were starting to narrate this process, you don't have to go any further than the Polish-born novelist Joseph Conrad and his Heart of Darkness, in a sense, the world's first atrocity novel. At the same time, there was also a growing recognition that integration created hierarchy. So it encloses the world and at the same time stratifies it. What Liang was saying, remember, and others were echoing his words, is that global convergence created backwardness. Unevenness produced this sense that some countries were behind others. It made countries into dependencies upon others. So this is on the scene already by 1900. And of course, the competition did spill out of control and led to the First World War. But it was the aftermath of that war that spotlighted the demands for social justice at a global scale. I mentioned that 1919 was kind of year zero for your field. But the Treaty of Versailles and the treaties that were being signed in Paris, Versailles was only about the reparations and terms of peace with Germany. There were a whole series of treaties that were signed. A lot of our memory of 1919 focus on peace, the failure of the peace, the idea of self-determination. But that year also pulled back the veil of injustices at the global scale. There was a reason why Nitobe worried in 1919, for a wave of revolt circled the world. In April 1919, clashing with police in Punjab led to the Amritsar massacre, something to think about, and the spread of the non-cooperation movement in India. A month later, anti-imperialist demonstrators took to the streets of Beijing to protest the transfer of German concessions in Shandong province, where my mother was born, and founded the May 4th movement. And they were all aware of each other thanks in part to the circulation of photographs and of journalists. For those of you who are also doing journalism out there, think of yourselves as protagonists in what we might call world making. Embittered by the post-war deal, Sunni, Shia, and working-class Iraqis rose up against the British Mandate authorities to demand Arab sovereignty. Northern Kurds did the same. These should be familiar names for you. 1919 was year zero for many of these social forces. And indeed, the Royal Air Force bombardment and scorched earth campaigning would bring the rebels to heel. But if Europeans could plunge the world into ruin in the First World War and then reclaim their privileges in 1919 afterwards, then it stood to reason perhaps the welfare of the colonized and peripheral peoples would be better served by charting other pathways and different norms and reasons for global integration. It was after the First World War, therefore, that we see the full debate over the pathways to progress. And ever since, there has been a furious contention about whether the have-nots would be better off as part of the global order or apart from the global order. And if part of the global, on what terms? The birth of the awareness that global justice was a distributional problem. There we have Sun Yat-sen. What could not be rolled back was the acknowledgement that fundamental inequalities were at stake. Consider the response of Sun Yat-sen, the father of Chinese republicanism. Outraged by the humiliation of China from the treaties of 1919, by the self-anointed great powers, and disappointed by the treatment of the struggling republic in the treaty discussions in France, at the end of the war, he sat down in Canton in 1921. You can see, I don't know if I don't want to mess, I'll blow the system up. The book that I'm going to talk about is this up on the upper right-hand side. I'm going to look at this map here in just a second. Sat down to map out what we would now call, Albert Hirschman would call, a strategy of Chinese development. And his brilliant manifesto, something else for you to look up, called The International Development of China, argued that his country, quote, is now prey to the militaristic and capitalistic powers, a greater bone of contention than the Balkan Peninsula, which is what had sparked the First World War in the first place. Sun insisted that the creation of backwardness, remember that word, and inferiority of peripheral peoples was what threatened world peace. So there was a relationship between political turmoil and economic development. Oh, thank you. Okay. By this process of integration, by creating have-nots in an interdependent world, empires produced weak links in the chain of integration. Sun Yat-sen was the first to connect the development of the peripheries to global peace and security. Without a solution to what he called the China question, another war was inevitable. I mean, he was very prophetic about what he saw coming, and indeed one might say that the Second World War did not begin, as we would say in a Canadian narrative, in 1939, but began in 1937 with the Japanese invasion of China. When I lecture world history, that's when I start the story, actually, to decenter the European narrative about what the First World War was all about. But the key to the problem for him was economic prosperity, what he called development. And the key to China's development was solving its backwardness. Now, I want you to bubble this issue about the relationship between peace and security and economic development. It's going to come back to us. I already kind of forewarned you that this North-South report of Willy Brandt's is going to loom large. It's a different imaginary about what globalization might mean when he coins that word. So just bubble, security and development being connected, right? Peace and prosperity. So while advanced countries for some were into the second industrial revolution, China could not even enter the first, right? The more integrated China was into the world market, the more it was falling behind. Because of the ways in which outsiders imposed treaties on feeble states, China, like many other parts of the world, was out of sync with modernization. The planet's progress had integrated the parts, but put them on fundamentally different paths. This was an explanation for how you got integration and inequality at the same time. Whereas Europe and America had proceeded through stages, this is another key word that enjoyed increasing currency at the time. We're going to get back to stages later on. Stages of progress, others were sliding through the opposite sequence into backwardness. Global integration had, Sun argued, created a battle over time. If I had a pointer here, I'd ask you to look at the map. This is his dream of what development in China would look like. And it's a map of infrastructure, of roads, and especially railroads that would integrate the national space of China and connect up to the wider Eurasian trading system. In a very strange way, if you compare this map from 1923 to the maps of the Belt and Road Initiative of China now, there is an eerie similarity between the 100 years that separate the two. Just putting it out there. Something you might want to write about? It also raised the question, when they focused on this issue of backwardness, what role did the rural populations and the peasantry in particular play in capitalist integration? Were they a dragging anchor or the source of some alternative pathway for thinking about the future? Contemporaries who thought about progress combined and entangled different kinds of historic time into a single order, mixing within societies what the world market had combined across societies. And no one captured this better than the Peruvian journalist. Journalists have a role in the story, José Carlos Mariátegui, who observed that the integration of Andean peasants into the modern world economy as producers of maize or metals like silver hardly dismantled those old feudal vestiges. On the contrary, it gave them a new lease. This was an important insight. Mariátegui observed that the cunning ways in which global integration relied upon and then reinforced older versions of organizing societies, so that institutions like mines and plantations for export relied on a gamut of coerced labor systems. They flourished because of their access to forced labor. So that ancient Andean, feudal, and modern systems all overlapped and interconnected. They produced a new symbiosis in the periphery, which yielded the brilliant illusion that pulling the country forward was also watching it drift backwards. The elements of 3 different economies coexist in Peru today, he noted in the late 1920s. Underneath the feudal economy inherited from the colonial period, vestiges of the indigenous communal economy can still be found in the Sierra. And on the coast, a bourgeois economy is growing in feudal soil. It gives every indication of being backward, at least in its mental outlook. So the word backward is there, but backwardness is being combined and reproduced and enhanced by integration. The advent of market forces, the penetration of foreign capital, and the rise of modern cities did not tear down the leftovers of the old world. It recombined them for modern purposes. In Europe, capitalism had dissolved feudalism, but in Peru, capitalism revitalized it. Integration had not only opened up a gap between the haves and the have-nots, it not only revealed how 2 times could coexist and tangle up with each other. Mariátegui argued that feudalism, peasant societies in the Andes, were the product of capitalism. Integration had created backwardness. So we're moved a long way here in the debate about how to think about development and then distributional justice. This is all a long prelude for the emergence of what would become formally known to us as development after 1945. Let me take a swig here. Pause. I've emphasized 2 things here. One, that the problem of uneven and unfairness had been around long before 1945, when development studies comes into its own. Secondly, that intellectuals, I include journalists, in what we would eventually call the periphery, I'm going to get to that word in just a minute, were actively engaged in thinking about it, what it meant to become peripheral in a world system. And the point is that the pressure to embrace development was coming from outside the charmed circle of statesmen and social scientists that we usually suspect of thinking globally for everyone else. Lest the powerful forget, as Mahatma Gandhi noted in a letter to the American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the discussions that led to the Bretton Woods Agreement, which I'm going to get to in just a second, that the promises of what were called development, quote, sound hollow so long as India, and for that matter, so he's writing to the president, Africa, are exploited by Great Britain, and America has the Negro problem in her own home. All this is on the stage when the Bretton Woods Agreement forges the architecture for the post-1945 order. And I'll just pause here to say that, and a little shout out to an old friend of mine who used to hang out with me in the halls of Robarts Library. We were talking about Eric Halleiner, has written a really interesting book called The Hidden History of Bretton Woods, in which he argues that the Latin American and the Indian delegations to the Bretton Woods Conference in 1945 that would lay down the design for the International Monetary Fund and for the World Bank, that argued that there needed to be a development agenda for the post-war order, and that this had been suppressed by particularly, to some extent, the American delegation, although there was internal fight among the Americans, but especially the British delegation. It's a book well worth reading called The Hidden History of Bretton Woods. Out of that, of course, came another round of disenchantment. Note the disenchantment after 1919. There were great hopes that we would have a new world order. Didn't happen. Social uprising. Something similar happened in 1945, with a couple of differences. But development was increasingly seen then as an enterprise devoted to one part of the world, the have-nots, at the expense of another part, the haves. Right? Justice was increasingly taking on an explicitly redistributionist mean. That is, that there had to be a channeling of resources from the haves to the have-nots. And its claims would acquire ever more antagonistic features. Important of all of this was the arrival of states and what we would call policy regimes, which made development central to their legitimacy, on the one hand, and on the other was the phase of decolonization that would set in Asia and in Africa. I would throw in an additional one, a new breed of social scientists committed to social change. And no one framed this new coalition better than the Argentine economist Raúl Prebisch, and an entourage of social scientists at the new United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America called CEPAL. Indeed, they positioned themselves explicitly as counterpoints to the Bretton Woods free marketeers who had gained the upper hand in 1944, and picked up on what the Latin American and the Indian delegations had been arguing for in those negotiations over the post-war architecture, to dream of something different. And by the mid-1940s, Prebisch had turned away from his earlier faith for liberal internationalism. He starts out as a liberal economist, not because he'd become more radical, but because he'd become more sober. He felt that the rules and the organizational defaults of the world trading system punished primary exporters and siphoned wealth from what he would soon call, as you're going to see, peripheries to the cores. And in 1945, Prebisch would start to refer to the plight of what he called peripheries in letters to his friends, an indication of how the vocabulary was starting to label global injustice. In the CEPAL offices that he would create in Santiago, an unsure and an frustrated Prebisch would pour his energies into something called, another thing to do research on, the economic development of Latin America and its principal problems. It was a declaration of discontent against the global economic order, 1949. Though couched in technicalities about elasticities of demand and business cycles, which you must all learn, right? The normative purpose came through. Not only were primary exporters stuck in a historic rut and condemned to diminishing rewards for their staples, I'm using a term borrowed from Harold Innis, whom I read a lot when I was an undergraduate like you, but unequal exchange would fossilize them there. It was hard to get out of the trap. In effect, the past was a prison. If Prebisch and his predecessors once thought that international integration was the key to breaking out of poverty, the CEPAL Manifesto, as it would soon be called, argued the reverse. The only solution was to turn inward, to reap the rents that had once been flowing out to industrialized powers, now to stay inward to fund domestic industrialization. Important distinction here. He argued for turning inwards, but not for exiting. He always believed that Argentina, Latin America, and the other peripheral countries had to export in order to generate the export revenue, the foreign exchange revenues in order to fund industrialization. This was not exit, right? It was reform, redistribution within the existing economic architecture. Prebisch represented what we might call a cognitive style, a style of thinking. Under development, and it would loom very large for the next 30 years. Underdevelopment was an intractable condition that required dramatic solutions, big pushes. These are terms that got used a lot in the 50s and 60s. Domestic industrialization, breaking unequal trade, overturning internal feudal forces. There was little that was small about the style, right? And the scale would loom very large. Prebisch's Brazilian colleague, really a very interesting Brazilian economist named Roberto Campos, called this structural diagnosis. Structural problems demanded structural solutions because anything else was doomed. Why? Because the rules of global integration did not reward the co-members equally. But there was an alternative to this voice, Prebisch was arguing with other voices. Mixed into the anxiety about post-war global economy was a particular kind of faith. Buoying the idyll of technical assistance, that was the term that was used at the time, was the precedent of a homegrown development experience in the United States called the Tennessee Valley Authority. American ingenuity, coupled with American social science, became a formidable duo. To the Hopkins economist Eugene Staley, American dams, that was what the Tennessee Valley Authority was all about, could serve as a model for intervention in poorer countries as a way to neutralize the threat of communist totalitarianism. Eugene Staley coined a term that I think some of you have been discussing in some of your classes, modernization theory, to denote an understanding of historical time. Whereas the likes of Sun Yat-sen and Mariátegui had conjoined archaic and modern features that reinforced each other, and Prebisch argued that peripheral progress was doomed to stall, modernization theorists insisted that the timeline of modern urbanization and industrialization could be replicated by being exported to the periphery, not rejected. Development meant mastering time in order to accelerate it. A social science in this key had special appeal, of course, to Americans, or for Europeans transplanted to a land of optimistic bravura. At the apex of its global influence, and in the wake of a war that had demolished the confidence in European modernity, American social science was flush with assurance. What's more, in the hands of some social scientists, the American miracle could be rendered less miraculous. It could be stylized for export, stripped of its redemptive exceptionalist storyline, which of course Donald Trump wants to recuperate, to fit a universal plot. Through migration, urbanization, adopting clockwise understandings of time, and deferring to authority based on merit, modernizers could be made ripe for democracy. In a fit of optimism, the advocates of modernization insisted that all good things go together. Growth begets democracy, and democratic life creates the right environment for sustained growth. The trick was getting off to the right start, isolating and capturing what were then called the preconditions, without which the whole enterprise would falter. This is from Life magazine, 1967. This was a creed ripe for muscular intellectuals, disposed to export the confidence of their models. Indeed, one might argue that it was the great American intellectual export. For the ultimate goals of development, noted the economist Walt Rostow, who's the guy lounging across the middle here, the wunderkind of the new confidence to an audience, there were psychological and political obstacles. One of the hubs for this thinking was the Center for International Studies at MIT. It opened a branch in New Delhi in 1955 to persuade Indian social scientists and policymakers of the wisdom of modernization. And Rostow would go on to write a very, very influential book, which I think we read in the seminar, as a little bit of intellectual history, The Stages of Economic Growth. Note the word stages, subtitled A Non-Communist Manifesto. A book that quickly earned a kind of Talmudic status and went through 12 printings in its first 5 years. Tradition, Rostow argued, immunized backward societies from science and the rewards of its application. It prevented villagers from upkeeping their roads, stymied productivity, and condemned them to a perpetual cycle of diminishing returns. Determined to turn the Reverend Malthus on his head, Rostow aimed to show a way out of the darkness. For the poor, quote, to enjoy the blessings and choices opened up by the march of compound interest, unquote. Well, Development was then all over the place by the 1960s. Right? Even as Vietnam was beginning to, we hear a little shout out here, think of Vietnam as a lab for modernization theory. He's National Security Advisor to the President Lyndon Baines Johnson, by the way. In fact, the United Nations declared the 1960s to be the development decade. American foundations rushed to support work in the third world. The World Bank became a full-throated global development agency devoted to recycling member contributions to build dams, railways, factories, and ports around Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It's hard to do a lecture about development without talking about Albert Hirschman. Thank you, Al, for introducing me to him. The White House approached Albert Hirschman in the early 1960s to join the Alliance for Progress, to become part of a team of the best and the brightest under the Kennedy administration. He was surprised. Had his recruiters not been reading what he was writing about development, because he was kind of a critic, right? About the delusions of what he called the foreign expert syndrome, or the action intellectuals. This is an image of Albert Hirschman in 1958, taken in Santa Monica. He has just finished his book called The Strategy of Economic Development, which is another well worth reading book. It's a little dense, but it's worth plowing your way through. Every time I read that book, it's one of these books, I get a new lesson from it. It's kind of oozing with insights. And he was very critical of the idea that the foreign expert could swoop in and offer usually his, technocratic expertise to pull backward, inferior peoples into the modern age. Now, the Alliance for Progress, he conceded, was a vast improvement over past doctrines, which held that Latin America's economic development could safely be left to private capital. Washington was even preparing to get serious about addressing commodity market problems, and even more, agrarian reform, which had been so abhorrent to legislators earlier in the Cold War. But herein lay the rub that he put his finger on, that would there not be something distasteful to Latin Americans about having as an American, having financed social justice for them? In the cause of redistributional justice, Washington threatened to make things worse by fusing its moral concept of modernization and justice onto the social scientific certainties of the master planners, these experts. By now, of course, many were starting to question the underlying assumptions of development talk altogether. Albert Hirschman, and this is why it's a good photograph, was trying to turn certainties about development on their head. Many were developing much more radical critiques of the enterprise. The Martinican psychiatrist, Frantz Fanon, was among the first to call attention to the hypocrisy of developmentalism and its sibling, anti-colonialism. For him, development was just a new guise of empire. After serving in North African hospitals, he invoked the acidic words of an unnamed Senegalese patriot, disenchanted with the promises, or the false promises, of the poet-president Senghor. We ask for the Africanization of the top jobs, and all Senghor does is Africanize the Europeans. Fanon did not think much of the narcissistic monologues of the action intellectuals, or of the colonial bourgeois and their academics, or the efforts to jumpstart nations with what he called theoretical knowledge, invoked to regiment the masses according to predetermined stage schemas. He's appropriating the language of Walt Rostow in this very sarcastic way, and his prose drips with disdain, especially for the intellectuals who rid colonies of their European masters while having assimilated the colonizer's culture, and so authoring a kind of what he called self-hatred that characterizes racial conflict in segregated societies. As he mulled over his psychiatric notes, so he's a psychiatrist, working in North Africa, his case notes of what he called of obsessional neuroses and the pathologies of the Now I would go into the technicalities. Taken from a shattered Algeria, he became convinced that true liberation required a violent cleansing. Moving from Lyon to Algiers put him on the road to write one of the 20th century's most wrenching works. I don't know if we read this book anymore in development studies. Les Damnés de la Terre, which I read actually as an undergraduate. I think in my first year, Marty Klein had us read that in, I think it was The History of the Third World, it was called back then. The book was dictated in Fanon's dying days. From April to July 1961, he was dying of cancer. The book's wrath aimed to slice through the mist of development's false hopes. The third world, he concluded, must start over a new history of man, which takes into account not only of the occasional prodigious theses maintained by Europe, but also its crimes. The most heinous have been committed at the very heart of man, the pathological dismembering of his functions and the erosion of his unity. And in the context of the community, the fracture, the stratification, and the bloody tensions fed by class, and finally, on the immense scale of humanity, the racial hatred, slavery, exploitation, you can feel the rage coming through in his prose, exploitation, and above all, the bloodless genocide whereby 1.5 billion people have been written off. So the disenchantment, even as the UN proclaims that development, the decade of the 1960s, that disenchantment in it was in. Another source of disenchantment and great concern was population growth. And there were increasing numbers of conferences and fears of what would become called, and it would be coined, and the result of a conference held in Belgrade in 1965, the population bomb. Note the allusion to a new kind of bomb. It was not the nuclear threat as much as a threat of population explosion. And in 1968, Paul Ehrlich, a biologist at Stanford, would publish a bestseller called The Population Bomb. Another bone for you to follow up on. Really, and just read the opening 2 pages of that book. His description of taking a taxi through the streets. Is it Delhi or Mumbai? I can't remember. Anyway, he's returning from a sabbatical looking at butterflies in Australia. And on his way decides to go on a tour in India. All these, what he called brown people, trying to get into his taxi. It's the opening phrase, imagery of the population bomb. And that book just sold like wildfire. So the disenchantment was setting in. Of course, another source of disenchantment, arguing for an exit from the system, was none other than Che Guevara. I'm going to skip over him. Q&A, if you want to ask me what Che's vision of development was, you can come back to me in the Q&A. So the development debate was forking. Some more pessimistic, some more optimistic, going in completely opposite directions at the very same time. And in this final section of the presentation, I want to talk about how development drove into the same logjam that socialism did in the 1970s. But developmentalism and development as distributional justice, though it did not go down with a fight, there were efforts throughout the 1970s to reform. In 1973, the non-aligned countries met in Algiers and adopted what was called an action program, calling for a new international economic order as the remedy for development problems, to redistribute wealth from the first world to the third world. And the NIEO was, and for those of us who were starting out in development studies in the late 1970s, and the early 1980s, we're still in the kind of afterglow of the romance with the idea that the international economic architecture could be redesigned. Of course, picking up on many of the third world languages from the 1950s. So when Paul and I started in this field, it was in the afterglow of many of those ideas. A lot of thought went into the design of global economic rules. And let's think about, I promised a little excursion here on the North-South report. This is Willy Brandt on the right-hand side. It was the last major report to call for global distributive justice, published in 1980. And in fact, it was in that book called North-South, no, it's not North-South Dialogue. What was it called? You assigned it. Okay. The subtitle was, I'll come up with it later, often called the Brandt Report. In it, he coins the term globalization and draws a line, the committee report draws a line between the global north and the global south. Now, in the end, the debt crisis of 1982 deep-sixed many of these ideas that redistribution was going to solve the problem both of underdevelopment and, he argued, peace. His vision of what he called globalization, or rather the committee's, was that if we could redistribute the wealth that was being generated by the arms industry into development projects in the global south, we would close the gap, and in closing the gap, make the planet a more secure place. So for him, these things were conjoined. So there was an effort to try to defend development, but it was already on its heels. By the time the NIEO and the idea Program for Survival was calling for redistribution as a key to develop, there was a critique now, not just of development, but of growth altogether. As the fragile core of modern, more lines, your lines are going to become important, we start to think graphically, some began to question the very concept of development altogether. Development was a threat, not because it fell short of its hopes, that was Fanon, right? Not because it made the poor worse off, that was Paul Ehrlich, but because it threatened to make everybody, even the people on the other side of that line between the north and the south, worse off. Development was destruction. Not surprisingly, this type of argument gained greater currency as the abundant 1960s gave way to the scarcity of the 1970s. And there was, from 1968, something formed by an Italian magnate and a visionary called the Club of Rome, or an invisible college. And its deliberations would uncork something called the Project on the Predicament of Mankind in 1973 to probe what was called the world problematique. Even before the OPEC crisis of 1973, the prevailing mood was looking very dark. And out of this would come an Armageddon report called The Limits to Growth, that argued, and if you look at all the curves are bending in the wrong way, population rising, access to resource declining, the world was on track to catastrophe. And in fact, they gave a date for that catastrophe. So, a relentless parade of graphs and sloping curves and doomsday scenarios on the inescapable centrality of scarcity, these dismal scientists plotted a dystopic future for mankind. So, this new vocabulary of constraints and limits that accented the man-made crux of the problem. It was not nature's fetters. What's more, the limits were not posed by the myopia of traditional man. That had been Rostel's problem. We got to get traditional man into the modern era. No, it was modern man himself. Okay? The man who was supposed to deliver humanity from necessity for Karl Marx, he was the problem. History, thanks to our capacity to mold the planet to our consumption needs, had bent the curve of necessity back to where we started. Development, instead of freeing humanity from nature, took us to the cliff, where we had to choose either to conserve the planet or risk the future of the planet. The fundamental antagonism, therefore, had changed completely. Once the struggle between the haves and have-nots, the new zero-sum locked humans and the rest of the biosphere into a basic struggle over life. Under these circumstances, it became harder and harder to raise the flag of development as a model of global redistribution. So what emerges, and here I'll end, what emerges thereafter is a parting of ways in thinking about development to yield two main trunks. from a shared root system of thinking about progress. Whereas so much of development thinking over the course of the 20th century shared a broadly similar attachment to the idea of forward motions of history, as one guided by purposive human intervention, the confidence in grand schemes is gone. And with them has gone the idea of distributional justice at the core of development. And we are left with three camps. The first is catastrophist, powered by a planetary consciousness and the recognition of the common space of our Anthropocene. The history of modern life can be seen as a geologic chronology, one which has witnessed the imposition of one species, ours, over the rest. What Edward O. Wilson, the chief scientist of this turn, has called the social conquest of the earth. And he goes on to describe in his book the ways in which humans had conquered the earth for its own purposes. The space once occupied by development then, as a critique of the global order's asymmetries, had now been eclipsed by catastrophism, that humanity was destroying the planet. That humans, now unfettered by rival species, threatened the ecosystem as a whole. Elizabeth Colbert, in an amazing book called The Sixth Extinction, you should look it up, she's a wonderful writer, gives evolution an altogether more alarmist spin, likening the looming threat to the asteroid that did in the dinosaurs. Now, it is extinction, not exploitation, that should alarm us. If Colbert and Wilson are right to draw attention to the big history of failure, that's what they called it, how the have-nots fit into the story is not so clear, except that they are going to be the first to go off the cliff. This narrative of development as conquest has its polar opposite, the view that economic prosperity has been that which the West has so much to tutor to the rest. Call this the triumphalist option. And this argument also has a vintage. We've been seeing this parade through since the 19th century onward. It has its champion, Hernán de Soto, another Peruvian writer, would gain fame for extolling the virtues of the informal sector, to join the parade, to unmask, reveal, disclose the secrets, what he called the mysteries of capital. If development has stumbled in his view, it's only because it failed to see that the mystery of capital was that everyone should be a capitalist, regardless of creed or culture, indeed regardless of their capabilities. The rest simply needed to be more like the West and see everyone as a potential, as C.B. Macpherson would call it, possessive individualist. This is a very U of T talk, right? As with Wilson and Colbert, for De Soto, what's important here is there is no alternative. It is, he concludes, the only game in town. So one is the road to destruction and the other is westernization. Conclude. Faced with such terminal narratives, change or go the way of the dodo bird, play or stay in your fetid shanty towns, there's not much room for complication. Yet, in spite of their differences between the catastrophists and the triumphalists, what these arguments share is a retreat from redistribution at the conceptual core of global justice or our understanding of interdependence. And we have been left too often to think, therefore, of development as charity. I remember when I was your age, inviting, I don't know if you were in the room, it was in one of these meeting houses on St. George, a group of our professors, you might want to do this yourselves, to have a conversation with a group of students about what development was. And I remember I had gone into Professor Gerald Helliner's office. He had been my professor of international economics, and I'd said, would you come to this we would have this informal discussion about what development is and foreign aid. And Helliner said, but development and aid are not the same thing. I said, what do you mean? As a young Canadian, that's what I thought development was. as an act of aiding other people in the language of charity. You can still help, but not necessarily of redistribution. Hence the kind of mockery here of what I think Jeffrey Sachs, another thing to look at, what Angelina Jolie and others are promulgating as a model of development. Like socialism, development is all but, it has lost its moorings as a way to explain the global conjunction of inequity and integration. The two followed similar parabola, fading out with the waning faith in collective solutions to common problems. As things now stand, we lack a systemic way to explain how integration and inequality are entwined. And this has given way to a chronic case of equality pessimism and a fog about how to reckon with the connections between capitalism and distribution. And, of course, the effects of that has been the rising tide of nativism, of exotism, and so on. Let me end with a paradox. On the one hand, we might argue that the sign that development has been a great success. And for the past 175 years, the tour that I've just given you, global life expectancy has risen from 30 to 70. The share of people living below the extreme poverty line has declined from 80% to 8%. The absolute number has declined by half. Literacy rates have gone up by 500%. Over 80% of the world's population now have basic writing and reading skills. And one might say that the great debates about development and distribution bore great results. And that's why they have faded. Redistribution is no longer on the table because of the success of development. I would be hesitant to be so euphoric. History has not ended. Time has not closed to one linear path. If nothing else, the effects of elections in the United States, Britain, and elsewhere, I worry about Brazil, I really do, that there is one linear path. If anything, development and distribution are more relevant now than ever, partly because development is not just a global South challenge. That was one of the problems of the Willy Brandt report. That line separated, but there are lots of parts of the state of New Jersey or the province of Ontario where development applies. Partly because we have grown more attentive to the importance of human capabilities and capacities in the relationship to freedom, but also because the global grand challenges of today are about development. Carbon addiction, the migrant crisis, distribution and justice are at the heart of what makes them challenging. Right? For inequality is the development issue. Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks. That's great. We can take Angelina Jolie off the screen if you want.
No, we'll keep her on.
We'll keep her on.
Thank you, Jeremy. Wonderful, wonderful to hear such a wide-ranging historical talk with such a reoccurring theme of the kind of contradictions of development, integration, and inequality that exist side by side and can continue to exist as a fundamental problem giving life to programs like ours, critical development studies. So, I have to check the time. So, we have 20 minutes, perhaps. The floor is open for questions for our speaker. I'll give you a little bit of time. Once you get to the mics, there is a button at the top. I think it's a little white button. If you press, it will turn red, and that means that your voice will be heard by the rest of us. We have one question now, but please, I encourage our first-year students to muster up the courage if you have some questions.
Yeah, you've got assignments, right?
Yeah.
You've got to write something. Let me help you out.
There we go. So please, as you begin to think about questions, please come to the mic. And we're quite happy to wait here for a few minutes until you come up with some questions. So maybe we can start with our first question. Juan, I'll let you.
It's working.
So yeah, it's working.
Got it. No, it's working now. I think it's working now. Thank you. Well, first, thank you so much for your presentation. And so I have like 3 comments or questions. One, don't you think that redistribution and development, instead of calling them like that, we should call them reparations, keeping in mind that centuries of slavery and centuries of colonization, wouldn't it be more fair to call them like the need for reparation? Another question that I have is,
hang on, I just got it. So reparations.
yes, reparation.
Right, okay.
Like if we should be talking about reparations instead of development. Please excuse me. Some 3 questions. Another one is like, how do you? Sometimes I feel like in the discussion of development, we talk about the North and the South, but we don't talk about class. And as you
Social class.
Yeah, class in the South, and the alliances of classes. And one specific question that this is out of curiosity. How do the relationship of the linking of the value of the dollar in 1971, when the United States linked the value of its currency from the dollar, if you see a relationship between that, the OPEC embargo, and the Latin American debt crisis.
Yep.
If you see a relationship, or if you can, tell us something about that. Thank you very much.
Okay. Do you want me to do? Okay. So 3 questions. Let me see if I get you right here. One is about how we might think of reparations playing a role in thinking about distribution, right? Okay. The other is what relevance class analysis and the place of thinking about social class has in the story. And the third is about the effects of, I don't want to get into too much technicality here, about the delinking of the dollar to gold and what we might call the financialization to the debt crisis. I'll be very brief. You know, to be honest, I haven't thought a whole lot about reparations. I think that's a really interesting question. Are you a graduate student? Are you a graduate student? Yeah, I hope you're writing your thesis about that. I mean, I think I've not thought of it this way. There is one way of casting the idea, for instance, of supporting the preservation of rainforests as carbon sinks as a transfer, a redistribution of resources and wealth from haves to the places where these carbon sinks exist. A big part of it is in the Amazon, as a form, not so much of reparation, but as an alternative model of thinking about redistribution that would conserve the planet. I think there's a vocabulary available to us, and certainly thinking about reparations and reconciliation is an avenue to maybe to rebrand redistribution. Class analysis, absolutely central. I mean, I didn't go into it here because I'm thinking more about how we think, our imaginations around development. But class analysis was central to so many of the authors, just starting with José Carlos Mariátegui, who was a very important Peruvian Marxist all the way down. But of course, the class analysis mapped onto global analysis. Increasingly by the 1960s and 1970s, the third world was seen as the place where the exploited majority lived to support the opulent minority in the global north. Of course, what scrambled that is globalization, right? That you have potentates in the south and immiseration in the north. So it doesn't map on quite so neatly as the critics of the 60s and 70s used to argue. So we have to be careful. But I think understanding the labor process is key. third on 1971, and there's no question. In fact, another shout out to Eric Kleiner. His first book is on financial liberalization in the 1960s and 70s and the ways in which the origins of the debt crisis, right, lay in the deregulation of capital markets in the late 1960s, especially in London and later in New York. And so the unplugging of the dollar to gold coincided with greater capital mobility. And that's the key to understanding the origins of the debt crisis. Okay,
we have a question here.
Hi. In your lecture, you emphasized, better? Yeah?
Yeah, it's on.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Good? Okay, cool. In your lecture, you emphasized the emphasis on Western development and the West versus the rest and the modernization theory that goes on with that. But how would these theories explain China's rapid development and industrialization, especially being so incorporated in the global market when they were previously in the map shown a developing country?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand. So there's a Western model, right?
Yeah, so throughout your lecture, you noticed the Westernization and this idea of the model that the West has taken. But how would those models account for China's rapid industrialization against these models here?
Yeah. That's such an interesting question. I mean, we could spend the next few hours debating, you know, what Sun Yat-sen called the China question, right? This is one of the reasons why I rolled it out. And if we could flip back to his map, sorry, there we have it, right? He had a project for Chinese industrialization, for infrastructure, for reintegrating China, which had been humiliated and marginalized by the great, what he called the great powers, and he included Japan among the great powers, right, was to save the world by reintegrating China and developing China. Right? And he even had these blueprints for capital that could move from London and Tokyo to China to build this infrastructure. And it would make everybody better off by redistributing resources, right, through investment. Now, I don't know that President Xi, Chairman Xi, sorry, has looked at this book or not. Right? There is no question, though, that the model that began to be tinkered when we were, you know, your age, after 1978, the Chinese reform really began. What's interesting is that industrialization was not seen as the place to go to solve China's problem. In fact, it started with agrarian reform and loosening up markets in the countryside. And the model that Deng Xiaoping turned to was not the Western model, it's actually the Japanese model. The first technical experts that were brought to Beijing to advise the post-Mao government came from Tokyo, not from New York, not from the World Bank. That China had to find a model that worked for China, its own stages. I mean, I could go on about this, but they never thought of themselves as deploying the Western model now in China. They were trying to adapt something that was specific to China's circumstances. There's much more to be said about that. But this, what is Western and what is not Western is a really, really interesting issue.
So we have a question over here to my right. Yes, please.
So my question would be quite general. My question is why frameworking? Because international development study is the only course I have that spent the first several weeks discussing frameworking, and we have just spent a whole lecture on frameworking. And also in this week's readings about all the former colonial officers' testimonies, they are still talking about their difference about being an academic and also a practitioner. So my question is what are we really going to achieve?
What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Yeah. I ask myself that question all the time. No, but actually it's a serious one. I mean, I think actually the key word here is critical. Right? It doesn't mean development doesn't exist. It means being much more humble about the claims that you can make about the social processes that you want to affect. Let me just fast forward to this guy. The tension between the certainties about development and the skeptical or critical attitude to development. Walt Rostow, Albert Hirschman, contemporaries, thinking very differently, or one might say Lachlan Curry and Albert Hirschman as two, and I mentioned this word cognitive style. So it's not against development. In fact, I argue, and everything is development now. It's about human capabilities, right? And about redistribution. To recover the soul of what the debates had been about in development means going back to that forgotten legacy. So what are you doing here? You're trying to think about global prosperity and global justice. You have to think of it as a development enterprise. But we can certainly learn some lessons of the past, some of the horrible things that were done under, among other things, this man's watch in the carpet bombing of Vietnam. While promoting agrarian reform in the Mekong Delta, we should be a little more critical about our models of time. So, I mean, we can get into practicalities, but I'm a historian, right? So what I professionally do is to remind people of things they prefer to forget, right? But if you want to be critical development experts, remember.
Yes, I was just going to add, if that is not a good justification for studying critical thinking,
I'm marketing what you've already chosen to do, right?
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
So my question was about, so what specifically about global integration is driving these inequalities between the peripheral and the core countries?
So I'm not going to give you a very satisfying answer to that one now. I'd say for all of you here, this is now kind of the question we have to wrestle with. When you think about development, that's kind of the biggie, right? And it's clearly degrading our institutions everywhere. Brazil, that I'm very worried about, the United States, where I happen to live right now, this issue about inequality is sapping civic cultures, public institutions, the whole commitment to a shared enterprise at a time that's actually crucial for the planet. Right? So even issues like dealing with carbon addiction is a development challenge. Right? But if we don't see them as issues of inequality at their core, and therefore redistribution as something that we have to explore, it's like swimming against the tide. Do I have time to give you an example? Can I give you a story?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure what time it is,
It's 8:52. You cut me off if I talk too much. Okay.
at 9.
1972. So here, the historian, reminding you of things that you prefer to forget. 1972, there was a UN summit in Stockholm. And it was the first of the UN summits that would look at the issue, and remember I said the early 70s was this very important turning point, the UN summit to look at the future of the planet's health. And it was at that conference that the first world countries, what were then called the first world countries, particularly led by the Europeans, argued for the need for conservation, that we were destroying the planet. And at the same time, a group of third world countries, led above all by Brazil and China, a really strange alliance, China under Mao in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, and Brazil being led by military dictators, on the other hand, joined forces to say, no, 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 we want to industrialize. Let us contaminate whatever we want in order to catch up with you. And so the divide opened up between the West arguing that the rest had to join in the shared conservation and slow down growth, and the rest saying, no, how else are we going to catch up with you? So the problem of sustainability and development was posed at the very beginning that we began to think about the relationship between resources and growth. Which is why I say you cannot address the carbon issue without thinking about the inequality question. Right? that it will be a real challenge to market the reduction of our carbon addiction without thinking about the disparities between the haves and the have-nots.
Okay, so what we will do, we have 2 more questions. I would like to take both of the questions simultaneously, so if you could first ask your question and then you could ask your question. That will be it for the questions, and then we'll give Jeremy a chance to answer both of them at the same time.
And correct everything that I said that I now recant on. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so in the lectures you say that like Sun Yat-sen, I mean like during like his life he had created like the models for the Chinas, and after like 1978, China has finally like developed and catch up with the Western. However, in the models of George Carlos, I mean like the line, like on the line, China is still like belong to the developing. So I want to ask like what really make like China like cannot catch up with like the Western even after it has like cast the role of like Sun Yat-sen. And my second question is that like my second questions I want to ask like in the lectures I believe that you say that like in order to make countries developing, you must have like competitive, right? However, if every country is like the same level, for example, if every single countries in the world have the same level of developing, how can we competitive to make them even more better? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah.
If you could ask your question.
Okay.
Hi, Professor. I have very brief.
Yeah, talk a little louder. The problem is me, not you.
I have a very brief question.
Yeah.
Since development can cause lots of kind of other problems like inequality and some environmental degradations, and then I want to ask, what is the final purpose of development?
Paul, help me out on that
Like,
one.
You have to say it again, sorry.
I mean, I want to ask, what is the final purpose of the development? Because
what's the final purpose of development?
Yeah, because during the whole progress, there are lots of other problems that are being caused.
An easy question for you.
Yeah, it's a good one though. I'll come to that in a sec. I have to reset here. So just very briefly, so on China, I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier, which is China forging a different model. And let me just roll back and to say, remember that there had been this argument in modernization theory that there was only one path, which was to follow the stages of history. China was flipping stages, inverting, playing with notions of time, and including accelerating time. We can get into detail. We don't have time to get into it too much, but it didn't think of itself as following the Western model. What we can take away is, though I ended with some figures that sounded very optimistic, a lot of what's driven those figures is a transformation in China. We're starting to see effects in Africa and South Asia and elsewhere as well, but a bulk of that data about social improvement has to do with the repositioning of China. But the integration of China into the world economy, which is why we have to bring redistribution inequality back into the picture, integrating China has had clearly global distributional effects. It's actually called the China shock, and economists are now looking at data on distribution to argue, and it's called the elephant's trunk curve, that essentially the Chinese middle class has grown in numbers and risen in upward mobility, but the working class of the industrialized West, and particularly the United States, has declined. So integration closed the gap between China and the West, but increased the gap between the lower classes in the United States and the upper classes. And there is a relationship between the two, which is why I say we have to figure out models to think about the relationship between integration and inequality. What's the purpose of development? You should ask these guys because they're really the experts. But I'm all for keeping things simple, actually. It's expanding human capabilities, and you can only do that in freedom. Right? And so, as Amartya Sen says, development is freedom. Right? But you can only be free if you have certain conditions to practice those freedoms, which is why we come back to distributional questions. There are, of course, many ways of doing this. So development isn't just one thing. And one might say that a critique of my presentation, just to be self-critical, is I've made it too much. Right? But that was on purpose. That was both to ratify what you're doing here, but to say at the same time that the turn towards charity, the turn towards micro-level interventions, right, may be limiting the horizons of possibilities. In a very famous critique, I don't know if you've gotten to studying the kinds of things that are happening through micro-level interventions. Are you guys reading about this stuff? Yeah. My colleague Angus Deaton has criticized the work that comes out of, for instance, the Poverty Action Lab at MIT to argue that it's a kind of social science, as he said, that is the equivalent of searching under the lamppost. Only choosing to fix and intervene in those small scale. Remember I compared the small and the large? Those things that you can fix, right? That's cheating the game, right? And he urges us to think in a much more expansive way about the possibilities of development. If you're interested, follow up on that debate between, well, Angus Deaton's reviews of the work that is being done that's become very popular, actually, in development studies. Those debates, in a sense, go on. Development is a space of debate and contention about histories of the future.
Okay, so I have 5 things I want to thank Jeremy for. The first thing is to remind us of this fundamental issue that really, in a way, should be at the center of all of our concerns in our studies, and that is the, in a sense, relationship between what Jeremy called integration, or what we might call now globalization, and inequality. That's central to all of our concerns, and I thank him for reminding us and stressing that. I'd like to thank him for giving us a sense of how deeply historical these concerns have been, going back really to the beginning of kind of modernity, penetration of capitalism, the emergence of nation states, that these are deeply historical problems that our planet have been grappling with. I'd like to thank him for reminding us how challenging it has been historically for a variety of different actors to try and find solutions to these problems. And they've been imperfect, if not destructive, in many cases. And I'd also like to thank Jeremy, which is really partially a theme in our program, for reminding us that many of these possible solutions have not come from the North, but have come from thinkers and scholars in the global South, from Sun Yat-sen in China to Yale Prebisch in Latin America, that there is a larger community of people thinking about these problems than simply in the West. And I thank Jeremy for reminding us all of those things. And then finally, I'd like to thank Jeremy for sharing his wisdom, sharing his incredible historical insight. At some level, it must be very challenging for you to follow all these amazingly interesting examples that he was presenting to us throughout the course of his lecture. But it's very exciting, and hopefully it has sparked your interest to find out more about what he was referring to. But I'd like to thank him for his time, thank him for historical insights, and just thank him for coming. It is wonderful to be the first community at the University of Toronto to welcome him back. Hopefully it's the first of many more times. And I have a few, first of all, a nice big applause. And Jeremy can't get away without us forcing U of T swag on him. So maybe you could come up. So he gets a U of T sweatshirt.
Oh, I never had one of these things. I didn't have enough money.
He gets a U of T stress ball.
Oh, I need one of those too.
A little U of T fridge magnet.
Oh, thank you.
And most importantly of all, he gets a U of T Scarborough mug to enjoy his coffee every morning.
Ah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.